You've heard something at night, don't deny it. A creak when the house was still, a weight settling at the foot of your bed when no one was there, a feeling, and this is the one that stays with you, that something was watching you sleep. Not threatening exactly, not moving, just watching, waiting. Every culture on Earth has a version of this story. Every people who ever built a home and tried to sleep inside it has passed down, in whispers and in warnings, the same essential terror. The thing that lives in the house with you. The thing that was there before you arrived. The thing that will still be there after you're gone. In Russia and across the Slavic world, that thing has a name. It has a face, a history, a purpose, a set of rules older than any church or government or written law. It has been feared, worshipped, bargained with, and blamed for everything from spoiled milk to unexplained death. Its name is Kikimora. And before this video ends, I promise you, you will never hear a creak in the night quite the same way again. Let's start with the word itself, because the word is a mystery. Kikimora. Say it slowly. Kikimora. There's something in the sound of it that feels ancient, that feels like it came from somewhere the modern world hasn't quite reached. And that instinct is correct, because the etymology of the word is one of the first things that tells us this creature is far older and far stranger than any simple ghost story. Linguists have argued about the origin of the name for over 2 centuries. One prominent theory connects the second half of the word mora to the Proto-Slavic root for nightmare. Specifically, the kind of nightmare that is caused by a spirit sitting on your chest while you sleep. You may know this concept by other names from other traditions. The old hag, the nightmare, the Alp in German folklore, the Mara in Scandinavian tradition. Across an enormous stretch of the world, from the British Isles to Japan, across cultures that had no documented contact with each other, human beings independently developed the concept of a spirit that causes sleep paralysis by literally pressing down on the sleeping body. The Mora is that spirit in Slavic tradition. It is the weight in the night. It is the pressure on the chest. It is the paralysis that grips you when you cannot tell if you are asleep or awake. And Kikimora inherited this association, which tells us immediately that whatever Kikimora originally was, she was connected to the most primal, most universal human fear, the vulnerability of sleep. The first half of the name, Kiki, is harder to trace. Some scholars connect it to an old verb meaning to peek, to spy, to look through a narrow opening. If this is correct, then Kikimora's very name means something like the peeping nightmare, or the nightmare that watches. And again, there is something in this that resonates at a level below rational thought. The peeping nightmare. The thing that looks at you while you sleep? Other scholars propose a different root for the first syllable, connecting it to various Finno-Ugric or Baltic loanwords that entered Proto-Slavic during the long centuries of cultural contact between these neighboring peoples. This matters because it hints at something important. Kikimora may not be a purely Slavic creation. She may be a composite figure, a meeting point of multiple traditions, a spirit that absorbed influences from multiple neighboring cultures as the Slavic peoples expanded and intermixed with their neighbors over centuries of migration and conquest. This composite nature, this ability to absorb and transform, turns out to be one of Kikimora's defining characteristics. She is not a simple static figure. She changes. She adapts. Different regions tell different stories about her. Different centuries saw her differently. She is a shapeshifter in both her physical form and her cultural meaning. And this makes her both harder to pin down and more interesting to study. So let us start with what the oldest sources tell us, and then watch how the story changes over time. The earliest recorded references to Kikimora in written sources date to the 16th and 17th centuries, when literate Russians, primarily monks and clergymen, began documenting the beliefs of the common people, usually in order to condemn them. These clerical denunciations of folk belief are among our most valuable sources for pre-Christian Slavic religion, because in their urgency to identify and suppress what they considered demonic superstition, the writers preserved detailed descriptions of exactly what those superstitions were. What these early written sources describe is a spirit of the domestic space. Not a spirit of the forest or the river or the harvest field. Those had their own names and their own personalities, but a spirit specifically associated with the home, with the interior, with the private space where the family lived and slept and stored their food. A spirit of thresholds and corners, a spirit of the spinning wheel and the loom, a spirit intimately connected with the rhythms of domestic life in a way that no other Slavic supernatural figure quite matched. This domestic specificity is crucial. It means Kikimora is not an external threat that invades from outside. She is not a monster from the forest. She is not a demon from a distant realm of darkness. She is, in some fundamental sense, already there, already inside, already part of the household in a way that makes the boundary between her presence and the family's own life deeply, disturbingly unclear. We will come back to this idea repeatedly throughout this video, because it is the key to understanding why Kikimora is so persistent, why she keeps showing up across centuries of Russian and Slavic folk tradition, why she has outlasted Christianity and industrialization and Soviet atheism and everything else that has tried to replace her. She is persistent because she represents something true about the experience of living in a house, of trying to make a home, of bringing a family through the darkness together. Something true that no amount of rational explanation has fully explained away. But before we can understand what she means, we need to understand what she looks like. And here is where Kikimora begins to reveal her multiplicity. Ask 100 people across Russia and Ukraine and Belarus and Poland what Kikimora looks like, and you will get 100 different answers. This is not confusion. This is information. The multiplicity of her appearance is itself a form of testimony to how deeply and how widely she penetrated folk imagination. But certain themes repeat, certain features cluster together often enough to identify a core image, a central picture that most regional variations build upon and then modify in their own ways. The most common description across the largest geographic area describes Kikimora as a small female figure. Not a towering demon, not a massive supernatural threat, small. Sometimes tiny enough to hide in a crack in the wall, behind the stove, inside a hollow in the threshold of the door. Diminutive, almost pitiably small, if she were not so frightening. She is thin to the point of emaciation, in most descriptions. Stick-thin limbs, a disproportionately large head, eyes that are too large for her face, or, conversely, eyes that are too small and too close together. Beady and bright and watchful in the dark. Her hair, where it is described, is long and unkempt, hanging loose and tangled, never braided, never bound. This matters in the folk context, because loose, unbound hair in traditional Slavic culture was the hair of the unmarried girl, the widow, the woman in mourning, and the dead. It was hair that signified a woman outside the normal social order, a woman who had slipped out of the categories that organized daily life. Her nose in many regional descriptions is long and sharp, sometimes curved, hooked. Her fingers are long and bony. Her movements, when they are described, tend to be quick and furtive, glimpsed in peripheral vision, gone when looked at directly. More sensation than sight, more impression than image. The perfect description of something seen in the ambiguous half-light of a house at night, when the fire is low and the shadows are deep, and the mind is caught between sleep and waking. In some regions, particularly in the north, Kikimora is described differently. She has the quality of the wild about her. She may be covered in moss or plant matter. She may have the feet of a chicken, a detail she shares with Baba Yaga and with other figures of Slavic supernatural tradition, and which may connect to very ancient pre-Slavic shamanic concepts about the boundary between the human world and the spirit world. Chicken-legged figures appear across Eurasian mythology in ways that scholars have linked to shamanic trance, to the spirit journey, to the threshold between the living and the dead. There is also a distinction found in some regional traditions between two types of Kikimora. The distinction is geographic and symbolic. The Kikimora of the house, called Domovaya Kikimora in some sources, is the one associated with the domestic space proper, the hearth, the sleeping loft, the cellar, the spinning corner. She is, in some formulations, connected to the Domovoy, the male house spirit who is the primary supernatural guardian of the Russian home, either as his wife, his companion, or his dark counterpart. She is part of the house's spiritual ecology. The second type is the Kikimora of the forest, the Bolotna Kikimora, sometimes translated as the swamp Kikimora or the marsh Kikimora. She is wilder, more dangerous, less connected to the human domestic world. She is the supernatural of the wet and the wild, of the boundary zones between settled and unsettled land. She is more likely to be encountered outdoors, more likely to be actively malevolent rather than simply mischievous, more likely to be connected to illness and madness and death, rather than to the relatively mild domestic disturbances of her household counterpart. The division between these two types may preserve a memory of something older, a time when the Slavic peoples were transitioning from more mobile, forest-dwelling ways of life to settled agricultural communities. The Kikimora of the swamp may be the older figure, the spirit of the wild that preceded settlement, while the Kikimora of the house emerged as a domestic version of the same fundamental fear, adapted to the new context of permanent home and hearth. What all descriptions of Kikimora share, across regions and across centuries, is the quality of hiddenness. She is never quite visible. She is never fully revealed. She exists in the marginal spaces of the house, behind the stove, under the floor, in the gap between the wall and the ceiling beam, and in the marginal times of day, the hours before dawn, the deepest part of the night. She is a creature of in-between, not fully present and not fully absent, not exactly hostile and not exactly benign, always just at the edge of perception, always in the corner of your eye. This quality of hiddenness is not accidental. It is the quality that makes her so effective as a figure of folk dread. Because the most frightening thing is not the monster you can see, it is the possibility of the monster. The creak you cannot explain, the cold spot in the room, the feeling of being watched. Kikimora lives in the space between the known and the unknown, and that is precisely where fear lives too. How does a Kikimora come to inhabit a house? This is one of the most important questions in the folk tradition, because the answer to it tells us what Kikimora fundamentally is and what she fundamentally represents. And the answers, across different regions and different time periods, cluster around a small number of consistent themes that, taken together, reveal a coherent underlying logic. The most common origin story found across the widest geographic range is this. Kikimora is the spirit of a person who died badly. Not simply a person who died, but a person whose death was wrong in some specific way. Understanding what makes a death wrong in traditional Slavic folk culture is essential to understanding not just Kikimora, but the entire system of Slavic folk belief about the supernatural. In traditional Slavic folk cosmology, death itself was not the problem. Death was a natural transition, a passage from one state to another, and when it was managed properly, when the dying person had time to say farewell, when the proper rituals were observed, when the body was buried correctly, when the appropriate mourning and memorial observances were followed, then the spirit of the dead person could make the transition smoothly and leave the world of the living behind. The dead who died well were not a threat. They became ancestors, protectors, sources of blessing and counsel. They were remembered and honored and fed at the appropriate times, and in return, they watched over the living members of their family. But some deaths were wrong. Some deaths disrupted the natural order in ways that prevented this smooth transition. And in the Slavic folk tradition, there was a whole category of the dead for whom this was the case. The dead whose spirits could not make the crossing, who remained caught between the living world and whatever lay beyond, who became a threat precisely because of their unresolved status. These beings were called by various names across the Slavic world. Zalozhne pokojniki in Russian, meaning roughly the improperly buried dead, or by more specific terms that name the type of wrong death involved. They are sometimes translated into English simply as the unclean dead or the restless dead, though neither translation quite captures the full weight of what the term meant in its original context. What kinds of wrong death created this category? The list is long and revealing. Suicide was at the top. A person who took their own life had violated the most fundamental social and cosmic order, had rejected the life given to them by God and community, and their spirit was therefore condemned to restlessness. Babies who died unbaptized were in a similar category. They had not been properly brought into the human community, had not been given a name and a place in the social and spiritual order, and so their spirits floated in a terrible in-between space. Mothers who died in childbirth, especially if the child also died, belonged here. So did people who drowned because water was a liminal element, a boundary zone, and those who died in it were caught at the boundary. So did people who were murdered and whose murderers went unpunished. So did people who died before their allotted time, before they had fulfilled the social obligations of their life, before they had married, before they had had children, before they had grown old. What unites all these cases is the idea of incompleteness. The wrong dead are wrong because something in their life or their death was unfinished, unresolved, improperly closed. They could not complete the transition from living to dead because something was still pulling them back. And that pull, in Slavic folk belief, was enormously dangerous. Because the restless dead were not simply passive hauntings. They were active. They wanted something. And until they got it, or until the living found a way to resolve whatever had been left unresolved, they would interfere with the lives of those around them. Kikimora is, in many regional traditions, specifically the spirit of a child who died before baptism. This is perhaps her most common origin, found across Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian folk sources. The unbaptized infant, who had not yet been given a name, who had not yet been brought into the community of the living, who had not yet been granted a place in the spiritual order of the Christian cosmos, could not rest, could not move on, was caught in a terrible, voiceless, nameless limbo. And that spirit found its way into the house, into the walls and corners and beneath the floorboards, and became Kikimora. The social context of this belief is important. In a world with high infant mortality, in a world where baptism was the ritual that publicly recognized a child's existence and granted it a place in the community, the unbaptized dead infant was an appalling category. It represented not just personal grief, but social failure, the failure to bring a new life properly into the world. In some traditions, the bodies of unbaptized infants could not be buried in the church cemetery. They had to be buried at crossroads, at the threshold of the house, or in unconsecrated ground. Their exclusion from proper burial reinforced their exclusion from the community of the properly dead. They were the ultimate outsiders, and their restlessness was the expression of their exclusion. In this light, Kikimora is not just a monster. She is a monument to grief. She is the accumulated sorrow of all the children who did not survive, who did not make it into the world, who were denied the recognition of a name and a place. She is the ghost of incompleteness, of the family that should have been but wasn't, of the life that was cut off before it could properly begin. Other origin stories complicate this picture in interesting ways. In some traditions, Kikimora is not the spirit of a dead person at all, but is instead a curse, specifically a curse that can be installed in a house by an enemy or a witch. In these stories, which are particularly common in northern Russia, Kikimora can be deliberately placed in a new building during its construction. The agent of the curse, sometimes called a builder wizard, a master who has made a pact with dark forces, conceals something in the walls or the foundation of the house during the building process. A specially prepared doll, a carved figure, a bundle of specific materials prepared according to specific occult formulae. And from this concealed object, Kikimora emerges, or is summoned, or grows, to haunt the inhabitants of the house. This version of the origin story tells us something different. If Kikimora can be installed by an enemy, then she is a weapon. She is a form of magical warfare, a way to destroy a family from the inside, to attack them through their most private and vulnerable space. The domestic sphere, which should be the ultimate refuge from external threat, becomes the site of the attack. The home becomes the weapon. This is deeply unsettling in a way that goes beyond simple supernatural fear. It touches on a real anxiety about the private space, about the home as a place of vulnerability. The walls that shelter you are also the walls that enclose you. The darkness inside the house at night is as deep as any darkness outside. And if someone who wishes you harm knows the right techniques, knows how to work through walls and foundations and thresholds rather than through them, then there is no refuge. The house itself becomes hostile. The third major origin story for Kikimora involves the land. In some traditions, a Kikimora inhabits a house because of what was done to the land on which the house was built. If a house was built on a place where someone was murdered, or on the site of an old cemetery, or on a crossroads, those ambiguous and magically charged places where boundaries between worlds were thought to be thin, or on land that had some other form of ritual contamination, then Kikimora was already there waiting. The house was built on her ground, and she simply remained. This version of the story is perhaps the most philosophically interesting. It suggests that Kikimora is not an intruder into the domestic space. She is the domestic space's secret history. She is what the land remembers. She is the past that was paved over, built on, refused burial. She is what happens when you try to establish a home without acknowledging what was there before. So Kikimora is in the house. She has been there since the building was built, or she arrived because of a death, or she was placed there by an enemy. She is small and thin and watchful in the darkness. She is in the walls, under the floor, behind the stove. Now what? What does Kikimora actually do? What are the signs of her presence? How does a family know that their house has been taken by this spirit, rather than simply experiencing ordinary bad luck? The answer is a catalog that is both mundane and terrifying, because it is precisely the mundanity that makes it so frightening. Kikimora's torments are not dramatic. She does not possess bodies or speak in strange voices or manifest in thunderous apparitions. She does not murder or openly attack. Her methods are subtler and, in their subtlety, more exhausting and more psychologically corrosive. The first and most commonly reported sign of Kikimora's presence in a house is disturbances at night. Not dramatic disturbances, not furniture flying or walls cracking, but the specific, intimate disturbances of the sleeping space. Noises, creaking when the house is still, the sound of something moving just beyond the edge of perception, the sound of spinning, a whirring, rhythmic sound, the sound of a spinning wheel turning in the dead of night when no one is at the wheel. This last detail is particularly important. The association between Kikimora and spinning is one of the most consistent and widespread elements of her folklore, and it deserves careful attention because it carries enormous symbolic weight. Spinning was, in traditional Slavic domestic culture, one of the central activities of women's domestic labor. The production of thread from raw fiber, flax or wool or hemp, was the foundation of textile production, which was itself one of the primary forms of economic activity available to peasant women. A good spinner was a valuable woman. The ability to spin was taught from childhood, passed from mother to daughter, and the quality of a woman's spinning was a marker of her character and her worth. But spinning was also deeply embedded in the ritual calendar. Certain times were prescribed for spinning and certain times were forbidden. The period between Christmas and Epiphany, the 12 days of Christmas in the Orthodox tradition, a liminal period of great supernatural intensity, was often a time when spinning was forbidden. The distaff, the tool used in spinning, had to be cleared of its fiber and ritually cleansed before this period. Failure to observe this prohibition was dangerous. The unspun fiber left on the distaff, the abandoned spinning, was an invitation to supernatural interference. And Kikimora is specifically associated with this abandoned, improper spinning. She spins at night. She spins when she should not be spinning. She takes up the work that women were supposed to have put down, that should have been properly completed and put away, and she works it in the darkness, producing not proper thread but something wrong, tangled, knotted, snarled. Chaos rather than order, disruption rather than completion. In some regional traditions, Kikimora does not just spin at night, she actively interferes with the spinning of the household's women. Thread is found tangled in the morning. Work that was set aside neatly the night before is found in disorder. The production of the household, the literal material basis of the family's clothing and comfort, is undermined. She attacks the work. She attacks the order. This is a specifically female domain of disruption, and its significance extends beyond the practical. Spinning and weaving in traditional Slavic culture were associated not just with domestic production, but with fate itself. The fates of Greek mythology spin and cut the thread of life. Similar figures appear in Norse mythology, in Baltic mythology, and many other traditions. Thread is life, spinning is destiny. And Kikimora, who disrupts the spinning, who tangles the thread, who works the fiber in darkness and disorder, is therefore disrupting more than housework. She is disrupting fate. She is tangling destiny. She is introducing chaos into the ordered progression of life. Beyond the spinning, the catalog of Kikimora's nightly activities includes several other characteristic behaviors. She rocks cradles. She rocks them when the baby is sleeping. which sounds helpful until you understand that in the folk tradition, Kikimora's rocking of the cradle is not comforting, but threatening. The baby woken by her rocking does not settle back to sleep, but screams, inconsolably, as if terrified by something only it can see or feel. The baby may become ill. The baby may develop a condition that the tradition sometimes calls kiknulosia, meaning roughly struck by Kikimora, a form of wasting illness associated specifically with her interference. The harm to infants is one of the most consistent and most serious elements of Kikimora's folk reputation. In a world where infant mortality was devastatingly high, in a world where parents watched their children die of mysterious fevers and unknown illnesses on a terrifyingly regular basis, the need to explain those deaths, to give them a cause and a logic, was intense. Kikimora provided that explanation. When a child wasted away without obvious cause, when a baby screamed through the night and could not be comforted, when an infant seemed to have something terribly wrong that no herb or prayer or practical remedy could address, Kikimora was the explanation. She was doing this. She was the reason. And with the reason came the possibility, however uncertain, of a remedy. Kikimora also harms livestock. Horses found in the morning exhausted and lathered with sweat, as if they had been ridden all night in their stall, show signs of her attention. In some traditions, she braids the manes and tails of horses in complex, tight knots that are impossible to undo, a practice called witches' locks or elf locks in various Western European traditions, which suggests a widely distributed belief about supernatural beings and the hair of animals that crosses many cultural boundaries. Chickens refuse to lay. Cows give bad milk or no milk. The agricultural basis of the household, just like the domestic textile production, is undermined. She also produces illness directly. Not just in infants, adults too can sicken under her attention. Specifically, the kind of illness associated with disrupted sleep, exhaustion, confusion, the inability to think clearly, the physical and mental deterioration that comes from too many nights of broken rest. In a tradition that understood the relationship between sleep and health in purely experiential rather than scientific terms, the spirit that disturbed your sleep was the spirit that made you sick. Kikimora, who woke you with her noises, who sat on your chest and produced the crushing weight of sleep paralysis, who filled your sleep with nightmares, was the direct cause of your deterioration. She also occasionally manifests more directly, though direct manifestation is rarer in the folk tradition than the indirect disturbances already described. A glimpse of something small and dark retreating behind the stove, a pair of eyes in the darkness of the cellar, a small shape seen in peripheral vision, gone when looked at directly. The tradition is careful to keep her mostly invisible, mostly implied, mostly a question rather than an answer. And in this, it is psychologically sophisticated. The partially seen is more frightening than the fully revealed. The almost glimpsed is more terrifying than the monster in plain sight. She speaks, occasionally. In some traditions, she can be heard muttering at night, just below the threshold of comprehensibility, spinning and muttering in the dark. The words are not quite hearable. This, too, is psychologically precise. The almost heard, the sound that might be words or might be nothing, the sound that makes you hold your breath and strain your ears and eventually lie awake wondering if you are losing your mind. Here is something the simplified, sanitized version of the Kikimora story usually leaves out. She is not always harmful. In a significant portion of the regional folk tradition, Kikimora is ambivalent. She can help as well as harm. She can be a protector as well as a tormentor. And this ambivalence is one of the most interesting and most revealing things about her. The distinction between the harmful Kikimora and the helpful one usually comes down to the condition of the house she inhabits. A disorderly household, a house where the proper rules of domestic life are not observed, where the work is left unfinished, where the rituals are not kept, where the relationships between household members are in conflict. This is the household that Kikimora torments. A well-ordered household, a house where the work is properly done and the rituals are observed and the relationships are harmonious. This is the household that Kikimora protects. In some regional traditions, a household with a Kikimora who is content is a lucky household. She will warn of danger. She will cry or moan before a death in the family, giving the family time to prepare. She will prevent accidents and deflect misfortune. She will keep the house safe while the family sleeps. She is, in these traditions, something like the dark twin of the domovoi, the primary house spirit. Where he is the beneficent masculine guardian, she is the potentially dangerous but ultimately domesticated feminine power that, properly respected, becomes a force for protection rather than harm. The implication of this dual nature is significant. Kikimora is not simply a threat to be expelled. She is a force to be understood and managed. She is the energy of the house itself, the accumulated life and history and emotion of a domestic space, which can either be aligned with the well-being of the household or against it, depending on how the household manages its relationship with that energy. This understanding of Kikimora as a force to be managed rather than simply a threat to be expelled has practical implications for how the folk tradition approached the problem of a troubled house. You did not simply try to drive Kikimora out, you tried to understand what was wrong. What in the household's life? What in its history? What in its relationship to the land and to its dead and to its neighbors that had made this force turn hostile? And then you tried to correct it. Driving her out was possible, but it was often understood as a last resort. And it was understood to be much harder to do when the underlying problem had not been addressed. If you believe you have a Kikimora, what do? The folk tradition provides a rich and varied answer to this question, and the variety of the remedies is itself informative. Different problems require different solutions. Different origin stories require different responses. Let us begin with diagnosis. Before you can treat the problem, you need to know what you are dealing with. The signs of Kikimora, as we have discussed, overlap with other supernatural disturbances, and the tradition is careful to distinguish them. The presence of spinning sounds at night is particularly diagnostic for Kikimora. So are disturbances specifically in the sleeping space and the area near the hearth. So is harm to spinning and weaving specifically. So is the particular type of childhood wasting illness associated with her interference. Once Kikimora is diagnosed, the remedies fall into several categories. The first category is prophylactic, things you do to prevent her from settling in a house, or to keep a present Kikimora from doing harm. The use of fern fronds was widespread in this category. Ferns were considered powerful protective plants, associated in folk belief with the ability to reveal and neutralize supernatural threats. Hanging fern in the house, strewing it in the corners, keeping it near the cradle, was considered effective protection against Kikimora's attention. Juniper was similarly protective, and had the additional benefit of being usable in the practice of fumigation. Burning juniper in the house, letting the smoke fill all the corners and cracks and hidden spaces, was a form of supernatural purification. The smoke drove out or suppressed the malignant supernatural, cleared the air of its influence. This practice has obvious parallels in many other traditions. Burning sage, frankincense, various aromatic herbs, and probably reflects something universal about the human tendency to use fragrant smoke as a form of spiritual purification. The use of rowan, the mountain ash tree, whose red berries were considered powerfully protective throughout Northern European folk tradition, was also important. Rowan branches or berries placed near thresholds, near cradles, in the corners of the house, were considered effective against Kikimora and other domestic supernatural threats. This is one of the points where Slavic folk practice shows its kinship with broader Northern European magical tradition, since rowan's protective properties are attested across Scandinavian, British, and Celtic tradition as well as Slavic. Iron was protective. This too is a widespread folk belief. Iron repels or harms supernatural beings of all kinds, and in the Slavic context, it applied to Kikimora specifically. An iron object placed under the cradle or near the sleeping place could prevent Kikimora from disturbing the sleepers. Scissors placed open under the pillow served a similar function in some traditions. The scissors had the added symbolic significance of being cutting tools, tools that cut thread, which in the context of Kikimora's spinning associations gave them a particular appropriateness as a countercharm. Prayer and Christian ritual also entered the repertoire of protective and curative measures as Christianity penetrated deeper into the folk culture. Sprinkling holy water in the corners of the house, placing an icon near the cradle, saying specific prayers at night before sleep. The church provided its own toolkit for dealing with supernatural disturbance, and the folk tradition absorbed it and integrated it with the pre-Christian practices, without much apparent concern for the theological incompatibility of the two systems. This integration is characteristic of Slavic folk culture more broadly. The folk tradition did not abandon its pre-Christian supernatural cosmology when Christianity arrived. It accommodated it, reinterpreted it, gave Christian names and Christian frames to pre-Christian realities. Kikimora was sometimes described as a demon in the Christian sense, placed in the house by the devil. But she was still dealt with through the same folk remedies that had been effective before Christianity arrived, supplemented now by Christian ritual rather than replaced by it. The second category of remedy is expulsive, things you do to actually drive Kikimora out of the house. These remedies tend to be more dramatic and more complex than the protective measures. They often involve ritual specialists, the znakar, the wise woman, the village healer, rather than being things an ordinary family could do alone. The most common expulsive approach was verbal, the use of specific formulas, specific spoken spells, addressed directly to Kikimora and commanding her departure. These spells, called zagovori in Russian, a term usually translated as charms or incantations, had to be spoken in specific ways, at specific times, with specific accompanying actions to be effective. They were not casual requests, they were formal commands, drawing on the ritual authority of the speaker and the accumulated power of the formula itself, which had been refined and passed down through generations of use. The content of these spells is revealing. Many of them address Kikimora by name and command her to leave in terms that acknowledge her power while asserting greater power over her. They invoke God or the saints or the authority of older spiritual powers. They command her not just to leave the house, but to go to a specific place, often to the forest, to the swamp, to the mountains, to some liminal zone outside the settled human world. The destination matters. You do not simply drive her out into the undefined. You direct her to a place where she belongs. Some expulsive rituals involved physically scouring the house, cleaning every corner, every crack, every hidden space, sometimes while speaking the appropriate formula, sometimes using specific substances such as salt, ash, or holy water as purifying agents. The physical cleaning and the spiritual purification were understood as aspects of the same action. To clean the house was to clean it of Kikimora's presence. The broom was both a domestic implement and a magical tool. In some traditions, the expulsion of Kikimora required identifying and removing whatever object she was attached to. The doll hidden in the walls by the builder wizard, the contaminated object buried in the threshold. Finding this object and destroying it would release the house from her presence. This required either specialized knowledge of where such objects were typically hidden, or the services of someone with the ability to find them through ritual means. There were also remedies that addressed Kikimora not by expulsion, but by accommodation, by giving her what she needed to be at peace. If she was the spirit of an unbaptized child, she needed to be baptized, even posthumously, even symbolically. If she was the spirit of someone wronged, she needed acknowledgement and justice. If she was the result of a curse, the curse needed to be identified and broken. These remedies required understanding her origin, which is why the diagnosis of origin was so important in the folk tradition. And then there was a category of remedy that is perhaps the most revealing of all. Remedies that worked not by confronting Kikimora directly, but by simply improving the household, keeping the house clean and orderly, completing work properly before the forbidden times, observing the ritual calendar, maintaining good relationships with family members and neighbors, treating the dead properly, remembering the ancestors. In other words, living well. Living in accordance with the community's values and the cosmic order. Kikimora, in this framework, was not just a supernatural threat to be defeated by supernatural means. She was a warning. She was the consequence of disorder, of failure, of the violation of the rules that held the household and the community together. To make her leave, you had to address the disorder itself. You had to put your house in order, in both the literal and the metaphorical sense. This is, in its way, a profound insight. The folklore says, the supernatural disturbance in your home is related to the human disturbance in your home. The entity that torments you at night is related to what you have left unresolved in the daytime. You cannot separate the spiritual health of a house from the moral and social health of the people who live in it. They are the same thing. Slavic folk culture was organized around a ritual calendar, a cycle of dates and periods that governed the appropriate activities of daily life and marked the times when the boundary between the human world and the supernatural world was thin or thick. Understanding where Kikimora fits in this calendar tells us a great deal about her nature and her function. The most important period for Kikimora, the time when she was most active, most powerful, most likely to manifest and to cause harm, was the winter solstice season, the period between Christmas Eve on January 6th in the Julian calendar, used by the Russian Orthodox Church, and Epiphany on January 19th. This 12-day period, called Svyatki in Russian, a word usually translated as the holy days or the holy evenings, was one of the most supernaturally charged times of the entire year. During Svyatki, the boundaries between the living and the dead were considered to be at their most permeable. The souls of the ancestors returned from their resting places to visit the living. Spirits of all kinds were more active, more visible, more dangerous. The divination practices that were such an important part of this period. Young women looking in mirrors by candlelight to see the face of their future husband. Families listening at crossroads at midnight for sounds that might foretell the coming year, were possible precisely because the boundary was thin. The information from the other side could get through. Spinning was forbidden during Svyatki. This prohibition was connected to the idea that the supernatural beings who were abroad during this period might interfere with the spinning, might use it for their own purposes, might tangle it in ways that would cause harm. The distaff had to be cleared, the spinning wheel had to be still, and Kikimora, who spins in the night anyway, who does the forbidden work in the forbidden time, is associated precisely with this violation. She is the consequence of Svyatki prohibitions not observed. She is what happens when the work is not properly put away, when the liminal period is not properly respected. This connection between Kikimora and Svyatki connects her in turn to the broader world of midwinter supernatural activity, to the host of supernatural beings that were understood to be particularly active during the longest nights of the year. The Rusalki, those beautiful and dangerous female water spirits, were most active at their own appointed time in early summer, but some traditions place their winter form in proximity to Kikimora. The domovoi was said to be particularly restless during Svyatki, particularly likely to make his presence known. The dead were abroad. The world was full. The connection between Kikimora and the midwinter season also connects her to the primordial darkness of the winter night, the longest, deepest darkness of the year. She is a creature of darkness in a very specific sense. Not evil darkness, not moral darkness, but the literal physical darkness of the winter night before artificial light. The darkness in which peasant families huddled around their stoves and told stories and felt, in the depths of their bones, the animal terror of the long night. In that context, Kikimora makes perfect sense. She is what lives in the winter darkness. She is the figure that gives form to the formless unease of lying awake on the longest nights of the year, listening to the wind in the eaves, and the creak of the house settling in the frost, and the sound of something that might have been nothing at all. No discussion of Kikimora is complete without a thorough examination of her relationship to the domovoi, the male house spirit who is, in many ways, her counterpart, her complement, and her competitor. The domovoi, from the Russian word dom, meaning house, is the primary supernatural guardian of the Russian home. He is the spirit of the household itself, the accumulated will and energy of the domestic space, and his well-being is closely tied to the well-being of the family that lives in the house. When the family prospers, the domovoi is content. When the family struggles, he may be troubled and troubling. When the family is about to suffer a major loss, he warns them. He is, in many ways, the spirit of the house's own good fortune. The domovoi is typically described as an old man, small, like Kikimora, and often hairy, covered in fur or hair that matches the color of the livestock he protects. He lives behind the stove, in the most important and most sacred part of the traditional Russian house, the warm heart of the home, the source of heat and cooking and comfort. He has left offerings, bread, salt, porridge. He is spoken to with respect. He is acknowledged and honored as a member of the household. albeit an invisible one. The relationship between domovoi and Kikimora varies significantly by region. In some traditions, they are husband and wife, the male and female principles of the domestic supernatural, paired as human couples are paired, with all the complexity that implies. In this reading, a household with a contented domovoi and a content Kikimora is a doubly blessed household, doubly protected, doubly fortunate. And a household with a troubled Kikimora must also consider whether the domovoi himself is troubled, whether the relationship between the two supernatural entities is in harmony or in conflict. This marital metaphor is interesting in a number of ways. It mirrors the human marriage at the center of the household, the pair that the house is built around, in the supernatural realm. The domovoi and Kikimora are the spiritual counterparts of husband and wife, and their relationship reflects the quality of the human relationship. A harmonious human marriage creates a harmonious supernatural pair. A troubled human marriage, or a house that has experienced the breakdown of that central relationship through death or abandonment or conflict, may create a troubled supernatural pair. Kikimora's hostility in this reading is the spiritual echo of something that has gone wrong in the human domestic sphere. In other traditions, domovoi and Kikimora are not paired but opposed. The domovoi is the benevolent guardian. Kikimora is the malevolent disruptor. The domovoi protects the household. Kikimora attacks it. The domovoi is associated with order. Kikimora with disorder. In these traditions, the presence of a harmful Kikimora may be understood as the sign that the domovoi has been weakened or driven away, that the protective masculine spirit of the house has been overcome, leaving the household vulnerable to Kikimora's interference. The gender dynamics embedded in these relationships are worth pausing on. The domovoi, the beneficent house spirit, is masculine. Kikimora, the potentially harmful one, is feminine. This might seem to reflect a straightforwardly patriarchal framework in which the feminine supernatural is associated with danger and the masculine with safety. But the folk tradition is more complex than this simple reading suggests. Kikimora's association with spinning and weaving, with the labor that was specifically and exclusively women's in traditional peasant culture, gives her a connection to a domain of power that was genuinely women's domain. The management of the textile production of the household, which was both economically essential and ritually significant, belonged to women. Kikimora is the supernatural presence in that domain. She is not simply a demon placed there by a patriarchal tradition to police women's behavior. She is the spirit that inhabits women's workspace, and her ambivalence, her ability to help or to harm, reflects the ambivalence of that workspace itself, which was both central to household survival and a site of potential disorder. In some regional traditions, it is possible to see the vestige of an older, less gendered figure, a house spirit who is not simply the dark female counterpart to the beneficent male domovoi, but who is something more ancient and more neutral, a spirit of the house itself, who has been gradually gendered and positioned as female and potentially dangerous as the cultural context evolved. Russia is a vast country, and even before the Russian Empire expanded its territories to encompass an enormous geographic range, the Slavic-speaking world was spread across an enormous geographic and ecological range, from the forests of the north to the steppes of the south, from the marshes of the west to the mountains of the east. In different environments and different ecological contexts, Kikimora took different forms. In the far north, in the regions of Vologda, Arkhangelsk, the territories bordering Finland and the Komi Republic, Kikimora is most strongly associated with the forest and the swamp. Here she takes on the character of the wild, the untamed, the non-human. She is less clearly associated with the domestic space and more clearly associated with the liminal zone between settlement and wilderness. In these northern traditions, she is sometimes confused or conflated with other supernatural beings of the forest and swamp, with the Leshy, the forest spirit, and with various female supernatural beings associated with marshes and wetlands. Her origin story in these traditions is more likely to involve the wild than the domestic. She is the spirit of a woman who died in the swamp, or a spirit native to the forest who has taken up residence in a poorly situated house. The ecological reality of northern Russia, where the forest was dense and close, where settlement was sparse, where the boundary between human habitation and wilderness was both literal and psychically close, shaped this version of Kikimora. In these traditions, she carries the quality of the outside, of the forest, of the things that are not tamed and cannot be tamed. She is Kikimora of the wild margins. In central Russia, the heartland of Russian peasant culture, the regions that produce the richest and most detailed folk records, Kikimora is most clearly the domestic spirit we have already described in detail. This is the Kikimora of the hearth and the spinning wheel, of the sleeping loft and the cradle, of the walls and the foundation. This is the most fully developed version of the figure, with the most elaborate mythology and the most detailed set of associated beliefs and practices. In Ukraine, particularly in Western Ukraine and the Carpathian region, the figure that corresponds to Kikimora takes on some distinctive characteristics. Here she is sometimes called by different names, Mavka or Lisovitsia, or simply the Pokutna, and her associations with the spirits of unbaptized children are particularly strong. In the Carpathian traditions, which preserve some of the oldest layers of Slavic folk belief, the world of the supernatural is thick with the spirits of the improperly dead, and the being who corresponds to Kikimora is specifically and consistently identified with the spirits of infants who died before baptism. This Carpathian version is particularly haunting. She is small because she was a baby who never grew. She is voiceless because she was never named. She inhabits the house because she died in it or near it, and cannot leave the place of her short and painful existence. She pulls at the threads of the living, not out of malevolence, but out of a desperate, inarticulate longing for the life she was denied, the life she was supposed to have and did not get to live. In this version, Kikimora becomes unmistakably a figure of grief. Not just the mother's grief, though that is there, but the grief of the child itself, the impossible, incomprehensible grief of a consciousness that never properly formed, that never got to be a person, that is caught between existence and non-existence, without the language or the understanding to process its own situation. In Belarus, the tradition is rich and detailed in its own ways. The Belarusian Kikimora shares most of the characteristics already described, but with some regional emphases. The association with cursed construction, with the builder wizard who places her in the walls of a new house, is particularly prominent in Belarusian tradition. And the protective countermeasures in Belarusian tradition include some distinctive elements, including the use of specific verbal formulas that are preserved in written collections of folk magic from the 19th century, and that give us a remarkably direct window into the actual language of folk protective magic in this tradition. In Poland, the corresponding figure is sometimes called Zmora or Mora, preserving the old word for nightmare that we identified at the very beginning of this video as embedded in Kikimora's name itself. The Polish Zmora is primarily a nightmare spirit, a figure that sits on sleepers' chests and causes suffocating, terrifying dreams. She is less specifically domestic than the Russian Kikimora, less connected to spinning and household production, and more purely associated with the phenomenon of sleep paralysis and night terror. But the family resemblance is clear. She is the same fundamental fear, wearing a slightly different face. In Serbia and other South Slavic traditions, the figure of the Mora, or the Noćnika, the night visitor, performs similar functions and connects the Slavic tradition to a broader European network of night terror spirits that includes the old hag of English tradition, the Mara of Scandinavian tradition, the Alp of German tradition, and the many other names given to the same, essentially universal experience of sleep paralysis across the world. The systematic academic study of Slavic folk belief, including the belief in Kikimora, began in earnest in the 19th century as part of the broader European Romantic movement that elevated folk culture and folk tradition as repositories of national identity and ancient wisdom. In Russia, this movement produced a remarkable flowering of folklore collection and analysis. The work of Alexander Afanasyev, whose massive collection of Russian fairy tales is the Russian equivalent of the Grimm's collection in Germany, was part of a broader scholarly project that included the systematic collection of folk beliefs, spells, customs, and supernatural lore from across the Russian Empire. Afanasyev himself theorized the origins of Slavic folk belief in ways that were influential for their time, arguing for a solar mythology at the base of Slavic supernaturalism. Though his specific theories have been largely superseded by later scholarship. More directly relevant to Kikimora is the work of scholars like Dmitry Zelenin, whose early 20th century study of the unclean dead in Slavic tradition provides one of the most detailed and rigorous academic treatments of the class of supernatural beings to which Kikimora belongs. Zelenin's work, published in 1916, drew on an enormous range of ethnographic sources to construct a systematic picture of how Slavic folk culture understood the relationship between improper death and supernatural disturbance. His analysis of the založenie pokojniki, the improperly buried dead, remains foundational for the study of Slavic folk belief and provides the most intellectually satisfying framework for understanding where Kikimora fits in the broader cosmology. The ethnographer Elena Ivanovna Lebedeva collected detailed accounts of Kikimora beliefs in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, interviewing peasant informants in various provinces and preserving accounts that might otherwise have been lost as modernization changed rural Russian life. Her field notes, preserved in archives in Moscow and St. Petersburg, are among the most valuable primary sources for understanding how real people in real communities understood and dealt with this figure. The Soviet period was complicated for the study of Slavic folk belief. The official Marxist-Leninist position was that folk superstitions, including belief in supernatural beings, were pre-scientific remnants of peasant ignorance that would naturally disappear as education and modernization progressed. Academic study of these beliefs was not prohibited, but it was ideologically fraught. You had to be careful how you framed your interest in supernatural folk tradition, lest you appear to be taking it seriously rather than studying it as a historical artifact. This produced a scholarly literature that was sometimes defensive, that bent over backward to explain folk belief in purely historical and sociological terms, while studiously avoiding any question about what the beliefs might tell us that was still relevant. Nevertheless, some important scholarly work was done during the Soviet period. The folklorist Vladimir Prop, best known internationally for his structural analysis of Russian fairy tales in Morphology of the Folktale, also produced important work on the ritual roots of folk narrative, including material relevant to understanding the supernatural beings of the Russian folk tradition. And ethnographers continued to collect folk material in the field, preserving it in institutional archives even when they could not always say what they thought about it in print. After the Soviet collapse, the field opened up considerably. Scholars could engage directly with questions about the religious and spiritual dimensions of folk belief, rather than having to translate everything into materialist historical terms. New fieldwork was undertaken in the 1990s and 2000s, in some cases discovering that beliefs in beings like Kikimora were more persistent in rural communities than the modernization narrative had predicted. The folk tradition had not simply dissolved under the pressure of Soviet education and urbanization. It had gone underground, had adapted, had survived in modified forms even in communities that had officially abandoned religious and supernatural belief. The contemporary scholarly picture of Kikimora is considerably more nuanced than earlier accounts. Modern researchers tend to resist both the romantic impulse to see folk belief as a window onto pristine ancient religion and the positivist impulse to dismiss it as simple ignorance. They see it instead as a complex, dynamic cultural system that encodes real human experiences and real social dynamics in symbolic form. And that remains vital and adaptable precisely because it addresses things that rational scientific culture has not fully explained or replaced. Let us be honest about something that academic folklore studies sometimes dances around. People did not just believe in Kikimora in an abstract theological sense. They experienced her, they heard her, they felt her. They woke in the night paralyzed with terror, convinced that something was sitting on their chest. They heard spinning sounds in empty rooms. They woke to find their work tangled. They watched their children sicken without apparent cause. What were they actually experiencing? Modern psychology and neuroscience offer partial answers. Sleep paralysis, the experience of waking during REM sleep when the body is still in the paralytic state that prevents you from acting out your dreams, is well documented and nearly universal. Somewhere between 20 and 40% of people experience at least one episode of sleep paralysis in their lifetime. During these episodes, the sleeping person is fully conscious but unable to move, and hallucinations are extremely common. Visual, auditory, and tactile. The hallucinations typically involve a presence, something in the room, something approaching, something pressing down. In the folk tradition, this is exactly Kikimora sitting on your chest. The experience is real. The interpretation of it varies by culture and context, but the experience itself is neurologically consistent and extremely widespread. The sound of spinning in an empty room is a more ordinary mystery. Houses make sounds. Wood expands and contracts with temperature changes. Wind in eaves and under doors produces complex sounds that can be hard to identify. The trained ear of someone who has spent their life listening to spinning wheels will hear spinning in sounds that others might simply interpret as the house settling. This is not delusion. It is pattern recognition working slightly too eagerly, the same cognitive process that makes us see faces in clouds or hear voices in white noise. The disruption of spinning work, the tangled thread found in the morning, has similarly mundane explanations available. The cat. The wind through a gap in the wall, a loose thread caught on a rough surface. Children or other household members who disturbed the work and did not admit it. In a household already primed by folk belief to interpret domestic disorder as supernatural interference, any of these ordinary causes could trigger the diagnosis of Kikimora's presence. The wasting illness of infants and children is the hardest to address because the reality behind it was so terrible. Many infants died of ordinary causes. Infections, nutritional deficiencies, respiratory illness, all of which were endemic in pre-modern agricultural societies with limited medical knowledge. These deaths needed explanation. They needed meaning. Kikimora provided both. And while the diagnosis was wrong in the biomedical sense, the folk treatment associated with it sometimes included practical measures, herbs with genuine pharmacological properties, improved sleep conditions, changes in diet and care, that may have helped even when the theoretical framework behind them was incorrect. But there is something more to say here than just reducing folk belief to misidentified neurological phenomena and ordinary household events. The people who believed in Kikimora were not stupid. They were not simply pre-scientific minds waiting to be enlightened by rational knowledge. They were acute observers of their own experience, and the framework they developed for interpreting that experience captured things that scientific materialism has not fully accounted for. The experience of being watched in a dark house is real. The feeling of a presence in an empty room is real, not in the sense that there is actually something there in a physically detectable sense, but in the sense that the feeling itself is real, is experienced, is not simply the product of ignorance. Modern psychological research on the sense of presence, the feeling that someone is there even when no one is visually detectable, has shown that this is a genuine neurological phenomenon, produced by specific patterns of activity in specific regions of the brain that can occur in perfectly mentally healthy individuals in specific conditions. The psychological reality of the haunted house, the house that feels wrong, the house where something does not feel right, is similarly real and is similarly something that modern science has not fully explained away. The accumulated emotional history of a domestic space, the tragedies and conflicts and absences that have occurred within its walls, can create an atmosphere that is genuinely felt by the people who inhabit it, and that is not simply the product of superstitious imagination. Whether or not there is anything supernatural behind this atmosphere, the atmosphere itself is real, and Kikimora, in representing it, is pointing at something real. The transition of Kikimora from folk belief to cultural artifact, from something people genuinely feared to something that artists and writers used as a symbol and a metaphor, is a fascinating story that tells us as much about the development of Russian culture as it does about the figure herself. The first major encounter between Kikimora and Russian literary culture came in the 18th century, when educated Russians became increasingly interested in folk tradition as part of the broader European romantic turn toward the folk. Writers and collectors began documenting folk beliefs not as threats to be suppressed, but as cultural treasures to be preserved. Nikolai Novikov's 18th century collections of Russian antiquities included folk supernatural beliefs. Mikhail Chulkov's satirical literary almanac of the 1760s and 1770s included treatments of folk supernatural figures, including Kikimora. But the deepest and most significant engagement between Russian literature and the folk supernatural tradition came in the 19th century, in the work of writers who were simultaneously shaped by European Romanticism and committed to the exploration of specifically Russian cultural identity. Nikolai Gogol is the central figure here. His early work, the stories of evenings on a farm near Dikanka and Mirgorod, drew directly on Ukrainian folk supernatural tradition to create a literature that was genuinely strange, genuinely frightening, and genuinely rooted in the folk experience of the supernatural. Gogol did not write about Kikimora directly, but his engagement with the folk supernatural world, with figures like the witch, the devil, the dead who will not stay dead, opened a space in Russian literature for the serious treatment of folk supernatural belief. Later 19th century writers worked with this space in various ways. Alexei Remezov, writing in the early 20th century, had a particularly deep engagement with folk supernatural tradition and produced literary treatments of various folk beings that attempted to capture their genuine strangeness and their genuine power. Remezov's Kikimora is not cute, not tamed, not domesticated into a comfortable children's story figure. She retains her darkness and her ambivalence. She is genuinely uncanny in the proper sense of the word, something that should be familiar but is wrong, something that belongs in the domestic space but is alien to it. In visual art, Kikimora appears in the work of 19th and early 20th century Russian artists who were part of the broader movement to explore and represent Russian folk tradition. Viktor Vasnetsov, the great painter of Russian folk supernatural themes, did not paint Kikimora directly. His subjects tended toward the more dramatic and heroic figures of the epic tradition. But his engagement with folk supernatural imagery created a visual language that other artists used to approach figures like Kikimora. In music, Kikimora makes her most famous appearance in the orchestral work of Anatoly Lyadov. His 1909 tone poem Kikimora is one of the most explicitly programmatic works in the Russian orchestral repertoire. Lyadov provided a specific narrative program. The Kikimora lives from childhood with a sorcerer in the Stone Mountains. A magical cat rocks her cradle while the sorcerer tells her stories about distant lands. She grows up in a magical sleep, and eventually she emerges to spin and sigh from morning to night, to hiss at good people. The music is extraordinary in its economy and its weirdness. The thin, high strings suggest something small and sharp and quick. The woodwind effects are genuinely unsettling, and the overall effect is of something that is almost familiar but not quite right. It is a masterpiece of musical uncanny, and if you have not heard it, I cannot recommend it strongly enough. Go listen to it after this video. Put it on late at night, and then try to sleep. The tone poem captures something essential about Kikimora's quality that is difficult to achieve in words. The sense of something moving just beyond hearing, just beyond sight, just beyond the reach of comprehension. Lyadov's orchestra creates exactly the atmosphere of the traditional Russian peasant house at night. The stove dying down, the fire dropping to embers, the darkness thickening in the corners, and somewhere in that darkness, something small and thin and watchful, doing its forbidden work. The folk tradition does not stand still. Kikimora has continued to evolve as a cultural figure in the modern period, and her contemporary iterations are sometimes so far from the folk original that they barely resemble it. But the transformations themselves are informative. In contemporary Russian children's culture, Kikimora has been domesticated and made comic. She appears in children's television programs and illustrated books as a grotesque but ultimately harmless figure, messy, chaotic, sometimes frightening but ultimately manageable, often the butt of jokes. This is a very common fate for supernatural folk figures in the modern period. The terror is drained from them, and they become either children's entertainment or ironic decoration. Baba Yaga went through the same process in Russian culture. The Green Man in British tradition, the Tomte in Scandinavian tradition. The creatures of folk horror become the decorations of the festival season. But Kikimora has also attracted serious creative attention from artists and writers who are interested in recovering the genuine strangeness of the folk tradition, in taking it seriously rather than domesticating it. Contemporary Russian fiction and speculative fiction has engaged with Kikimora on her own terms, using her as a vehicle for exploring the genuine psychological territory she maps. The haunted domestic space, the horror of the private sphere, the terror of what might be living inside the walls of the most intimate place. In video games, Kikimora has appeared in the Witcher series, the enormously successful Polish fantasy franchise that draws heavily on Slavic folk supernatural tradition, where she is depicted as a genuinely dangerous supernatural enemy. The Witcher games and novels deserve credit for taking Slavic folk supernatural tradition seriously as world-building material, rather than simply borrowing surface elements and stripping them of meaning. Kikimora in the Witcher universe retains some of her original characteristics while being adapted for a gaming context in ways that are thoughtful rather than purely cosmetic. International interest in Slavic folk tradition, which has grown considerably in recent years as fantasy fiction and game design have looked for alternatives to the exhausted conventions of Tolkien-derived fantasy, has brought Kikimora to new audiences in new contexts. She appears in tabletop role-playing games, in fantasy novels by non-Slavic authors who have done their research, in horror films and short stories that engage genuinely with the folk tradition. This international spread is itself a form of the same adaptive survival that has characterized the figure throughout its history. She changes, she finds new homes, she moves into new spaces and makes herself at home there. The persistence of Kikimora in popular culture also reflects something about the current cultural moment. We live in an era of widespread interest in folklore, in folk horror, in the reclamation of pre-modern supernatural traditions that were pushed aside by modernity and modernism. The folk horror genre in film, the mushrooming of interest in traditional European folk belief in online communities, the popularity of dark folk aesthetics in music and visual art, all of this creates a space in which Kikimora can find a new audience, an audience that is genuinely interested in what the old traditions were actually saying, rather than in the cleaned-up, child-friendly versions that the 20th century preferred. And that genuine interest matters, because Kikimora, the real Kikimora of the folk tradition, has things to say that are still worth hearing, about grief and incompleteness and the history of a space, about what lives in the walls of the house you think you know, about the vulnerability of sleep and the darkness of winter, and the sounds that houses make when no one is supposed to be listening. Throughout this video, we have discussed Kikimora in abstract and systematic terms. Now let us look at specific cases, specific accounts from the folk record that show how real people in real communities actually experienced and talked about this figure. These accounts come from the ethnographic records of the 19th and 20th centuries, from field notes of ethnographers, from published collections of folk testimonies, from the accounts preserved in regional archives. They are the actual words of people who lived with this belief, who experienced what they understood to be Kikimora's presence, and who tried to deal with it within the framework of their tradition. The first account comes from a Vologda province collection, recorded in the late 19th century. A peasant woman describes how Kikimora came to inhabit her family's house. She says, "After my baby died, he lived only 3 days. He was not yet christened when he died. We began to hear sounds in the house at night, spinning sounds, like a wheel turning, but we had no wheel near the stove where the sound came from. My husband heard it too. Our livestock became uneasy. The cow gave less milk. My next child, a girl, became sick with a wasting illness. We went to the Znakarka, who told us it was the baby, the unchristened one. He had become Kikimora and was troubling us because he had no name. She told us what to do and we did it, and after that the sound stopped. But I still think of him. I still hear the wheel sometimes when the house is very quiet." This account is remarkable for several reasons. The woman makes the connection herself between the unbaptized dead infant and the supernatural disturbance. She understands the folk logic of why her baby became Kikimora. And her closing words, "I still hear the wheel sometimes, when the house is very quiet," suggests that the ritual resolution provided by the Znakarka did not entirely close the wound. The grief remained. The child remained, in some sense, in the house. The folk remedy addressed the supernatural disturbance but could not address the mother's sorrow. The second account comes from a Belarusian collection, recorded in the early 20th century. A man describes his experience with a Kikimora in a newly built house. He says, "The house was new, we had just moved in, but from the first night there was something wrong. My wife could not sleep. She said something was pulling her hair in the night, tangling it while she slept. I heard the sound of something small running in the walls, like a mouse but bigger with a different sound. Our neighbor told us that the man who built the house was known to have special knowledge, that he was the kind who could put something in the walls, and that we should look. We tore apart part of the wall near the stove and found a small figure made of rags and straw and something else I could not identify, something dark and dry. We burned it. The disturbances stopped. This account perfectly illustrates the builder-wizard tradition, the idea that Kikimora can be installed as a curse during construction. The practical detail of the found object is particularly interesting. Something was physically found in the wall, whether it was an actual magical object placed by an enemy or simply the kind of debris that gets built into walls during construction. And walls in traditional construction could contain all sorts of things, some of them organic and eventually unidentifiable. The finding and destruction of it provided resolution. The act of finding something, naming it, and destroying it gave the family agency over their situation and ended the disturbance. The third account is from a 20th century collection, recorded in the 1960s in rural Russia, despite the officially atheist context. An elderly woman, speaking carefully, describes her childhood experience of Kikimora. She says, "When I was a girl, we lived in a house that was troubled. Not always, not every night, but sometimes. We would hear spinning. We would find our work tangled in the morning when we were sure we had put it away properly. My mother knew what it was. She was not afraid. She treated it like a member of the household that was difficult, like a relative who is troublesome but you cannot send away. She would speak to it sometimes in the evening, before we went to sleep. Just words, not any particular formula, just speaking to it, acknowledging it. And it seemed to help. She said, 'It is a lost one. It is someone who did not finish their life. We should not be unkind.'" This account is perhaps the most moving of the three. The mother's approach, speaking to Kikimora, acknowledging her, refusing to treat her as simply a threat to be expelled, reflects a tradition of accommodation that we discussed earlier. And the mother's characterization, "It is a lost one, it is someone who did not finish their life," is a remarkably compassionate framing of what this entity is. Not a demon, not a monster, a lost one. Someone incomplete, someone who did not finish. The fourth account comes from a Siberian collection, recorded in the late 19th century during the period of ethnographic surveys that accompanied Russian administrative expansion into Siberia. A settler family, originally from central Russia, describes how Kikimora followed them from their old home to their new one. This is unusual. Most traditions treat Kikimora as attached to a specific place rather than a specific family. But it speaks to the psychological truth of the account. When you carry grief with you, when the unresolved things in your life travel with you wherever you go, the supernatural follows. The story says, "We thought she stayed behind when we moved, but she came with us. She was in the walls of the new house before we finished building them." My husband said it was the same one. He recognized her sound. I believe him. Some things you cannot leave behind by moving. This account opens up a dimension of Kikimora's folklore that is less often discussed. The possibility that she is not fully separable from the family she haunts. That she is, in some sense, theirs. Their grief, their incompleteness, their unresolved past, made manifest in the walls of wherever they happen to be living. This reading places her even more firmly in the domain of psychology, of the way the past travels with us, whether we want it to or not. We have already touched on the cross-cultural connections between Kikimora and other supernatural figures. The sleep paralysis spirits of various European traditions, the house spirits of various cultures. Let us now explore these connections in more depth, because they reveal something important about what Kikimora represents at a level deeper than any specific cultural tradition. The experience of being oppressed in sleep by an invisible presence is documented in virtually every culture that has left records, and in many cultures that have not left written records, but whose oral traditions have been documented by ethnographers. The Old Hag of Newfoundland tradition, where the phenomenon is particularly well documented, is one of the most frequently cited. People in Newfoundland, and in the broader English-speaking world, describe waking in the night paralyzed, with a feeling of a presence in the room and a weight on the chest, in terms that are almost identical to the descriptions associated with Kikimora in Russian tradition. The supernatural explanation differs. Old Hag is typically understood as a witch who has traveled in spirit to torment the sleeper, but the experience and its physical description are the same. In Ethiopia, the figure of the Tsar is associated with possession and oppression that has some parallels with Kikimora's nighttime interference. In Japan, the Kanashibari, the state of being bound in metal, the Japanese folk name for sleep paralysis, has its associated supernatural beings, figures of folklore who are understood to cause the experience. In China, a similar tradition of the bound sleeper and the pressing ghost. In West Africa, in the Caribbean, in South America, everywhere people sleep, everywhere people experience the vulnerability of the sleeping state, they have developed frameworks for understanding the night visitor, the pressure on the chest, the paralysis, and the terror. This universality tells us something profound. It tells us that Kikimora is not a peculiarity of Slavic culture or a quirk of a specific historical moment. She is a specific cultural instantiation of something universal, a universal human experience, a universal human fear that every culture has had to name and understand and live with. The name changes. The physical description changes. The origin story and the associated ritual responses change. But underneath all the variation is the same experience, the same vulnerability, the same dark bedroom, the same not quite movement in the peripheral vision. The house spirit traditions of various cultures also show striking parallels. The brownie of Scottish and English tradition, a helpful household spirit that does domestic chores by night in exchange for offerings of milk and cream, and that becomes mischievous and harmful if not properly acknowledged, has an obvious family resemblance to the domestic Kikimora. The Tomt or Nisse of Scandinavian tradition is another close parallel, a small, elderly male figure associated with the farmstead, protective when properly honored, dangerous when neglected. The Domovik of Ukrainian tradition is virtually identical to the Russian Domovoi. The Lar of Roman tradition, the household god whose offerings kept the family safe, is a more distant but still recognizable cousin. What all these figures share is the fundamental idea that a home has a spiritual life, that the domestic space is not simply a physical structure, but a living entity with its own energy and its own needs, and that the family's well-being depends on maintaining a proper relationship with that spiritual life. This is not a primitive superstition. It is a sophisticated understanding of the home as a complex ecology, physical, social, emotional, spiritual, in which all the elements are interconnected and in which neglect of any one element can have consequences for the whole. Modern psychology has its own framework for understanding the same insight. The concept of the family system, the idea that a family is not simply a collection of individuals, but a system in which the health of each member affects and is affected by the health of every other member, and in which the history of the system itself shapes the experience of current members, maps onto the folk understanding of the household spirit with surprising precision. The family's past, its tragedies, its conflicts, its unresolved losses, continues to shape the family's present. The dead continue to influence the living. The walls of the house hold the history of what has happened within them, and that history can be helpful or harmful depending on how it is acknowledged and processed. Kikimora is, in this reading, the folk psychology of the family system. She is the spirit of what is unresolved. She is the presence of what was not properly grieved or acknowledged or completed. And the folk remedies for her presence are, in their way, folk psychological interventions, ways of naming and acknowledging and releasing what has been suppressed. The parallel with psychotherapy is imperfect, but it is real, and it is one of the reasons why the folk tradition remains relevant, even for people who do not believe in supernatural beings. How old is Kikimora? This is a question that scholars approach with great caution, because the evidence gets thin very quickly as you push back before the period of written documentation, which for the Slavic world means before approximately the 10th century. Before that, we have archaeology and comparative linguistics, and the traces left in later traditions, but not texts. The Slavs did not write their religion down. What they believed in the centuries before Christianity arrived, we can only infer. But the inferences are interesting. The oldest layers of Slavic religion, as reconstructed by scholars working from archaeological evidence and comparative analysis, seem to have included a rich complex of belief about the dead and about the relationship between the dead and the living. Evidence from burial sites suggests elaborate funeral practices, clearly aimed at ensuring that the dead made the proper transition out of the world of the living and stayed there. The presence of significant quantities of grave goods, food, tools, sometimes the bodies of horses or other animals, suggests belief in the dead's need for provisions in whatever came after. The evidence of post-funerary deposits at gravesites, offerings brought to the dead after burial, suggests ongoing relationship between the living and the dead, ongoing obligation and reciprocity. The anxiety about the improperly dead, which is so central to the tradition of which Kikimora is a part, was probably rooted in this ancient funeral culture. If the proper rituals were not performed, if the dead were not properly provisioned, if the transition was not properly managed, something could go wrong. The dead might not make the crossing. They might remain. And a dead person who remained was dangerous. Not out of malice necessarily, but simply by virtue of the disruption their remaining caused in the cosmic order. Before Christianity provided the concept of heaven and hell and a clear cosmological destination for the dead, Slavic religion seems to have understood the dead as remaining in some sense close, in the grave, in the house, in the air, and needing to be managed through ongoing ritual attention. The ancestors were present and could be helpful or harmful depending on how they were treated. Kikimora, in this framework, is a spirit that belongs to this ancient cult of the dead, an ancestor who has been improperly treated or who died in circumstances that prevented the proper management of their transition. The connection to spinning and thread also has deep roots. Across the Indo-European world, the broad family of cultures that includes Slavic, Germanic, Celtic, Greek, Roman, Iranian, and Indic traditions, there is a consistent association between female supernatural figures and spinning and weaving, and between the thread of spinning and the thread of fate. The Norns of Norse mythology spin fate at the foot of the world tree. The fates of Greek mythology spin, measure, and cut the thread of life. The Morrigan of Irish mythology has associations with weaving and fate. These figures are distributed across cultures that separated from a common ancestor thousands of years ago, which suggests that the association between feminine supernatural power and the technology of thread making goes back to an extremely early period in the Indo-European tradition. Kikimora's spinning in this light is not an accidental association with a common domestic activity. It connects her to one of the oldest and most widespread symbolic complexes in the human world. The idea that fate is a thread, that life is a thread, that the spinning of thread and the spinning of destiny are aspects of the same reality, and that the supernatural beings who inhabit the liminal spaces of the world are the ones who work this thread in the dark, who tangle or extend or cut what should have been the ordered progression of a human life. This deep root in the Indo-European symbolic tradition also helps explain why Kikimora is so persistent. She is not a local superstition that can be easily uprooted and replaced. She is connected to one of the most ancient and most deeply embedded symbolic structures in the cultural inheritance of half the world. When you hear her spinning in the night, you are hearing an echo of something that began long before the Slavic peoples existed as a distinct people, long before Russia was a country, long before Christianity was a religion. She is older than any of the frameworks that have tried to explain her away. We have touched on gender throughout this video, but the topic deserves its own sustained attention, because the gendering of the domestic supernatural tells us something important about the social organization of the world that produced these beliefs. The domestic space in traditional Slavic peasant culture was not a neutral zone. It was a specifically gendered space. The management of the house, the care of the fire, the preparation of food, the management of textile production, the care of children, the maintenance of the household's relationship with the supernatural world of house spirits and ancestors, all of this was specifically women's work. Men's work was outside, the fields, the forest, the marketplace, the world of public affairs. The threshold of the house was a gender boundary as much as a physical one. This gendering of space meant that the domestic supernatural was specifically female. The entities that inhabited the interior of the house, that governed its spiritual life, that represented its hidden powers, these were female entities. Kikimora is female. The Rusalki, when they came into the house, were female. The female ancestors whose spirits were honored at the domestic hearth were specifically female ancestors. The wise women who managed the household's relationship with the supernatural world were women. This is not simply a matter of gender stereotyping. It reflects a real social reality in which women were the primary managers of the domestic sphere, and therefore the primary experts on the domestic supernatural. The folk knowledge about Kikimora, how to recognize her, how to deal with her, how to prevent her, how to appease her, was primarily women's knowledge, passed from mother to daughter as part of the broader inheritance of domestic expertise. A young woman learning to manage a household was learning not just how to cook and spin and organize, but how to manage the spiritual life of the domestic space. The natural and the supernatural were not separate domains in this knowledge system. They were continuous. Kikimora in this light is the supernatural mirror of the woman of the household. She occupies the same space. She does the same work, but wrong in the dark at the wrong time. She is the shadow self of the domestic woman, the figure who represents what happens to domestic energy when it is wrong, when it is denied its proper place, when it is incomplete. The unbaptized child who becomes Kikimora is the child who never grew up to become the domestic woman she should have been. The angry Kikimora is the anger of the domestic woman displaced onto a supernatural figure. The helpful Kikimora who warns and protects is the domestic woman's power to sustain and protect the household given supernatural form. This is not an entirely comfortable reading because it can be read as a way of naturalizing and mystifying the social subordination of women, of converting the real material constraints of women's lives into supernatural figures that seem inevitable and eternal rather than historical and contestable. And that reading is not wrong. Folk belief systems have often served to naturalize and reinforce existing social hierarchies by giving them supernatural sanction. But the folk tradition is not a simple tool of social control. It is also a system in which real people work out real experiences of power and powerlessness, real experiences of what it means to inhabit a particular social position and body. The figure of Kikimora encodes not just the dominant culture's anxiety about women's power, but also women's own understanding of their situation, their recognition of the spiritual weight of the domestic space, their acknowledgement of the grief and loss that often went unacknowledged in ordinary life, their sense that the house itself held a history that had to be managed and not simply ignored. The mother who spoke to Kikimora with compassion, who said, "It is a lost one. It is someone who did not finish their life. We should not be unkind," was doing something that required both folk knowledge and a particular kind of emotional wisdom. She was acknowledging the grief that had been refused proper expression. She was making space for the incomplete. She was, in her way, doing the spiritual work of the household, the work that no one else was going to do if she did not do it. To fully understand Kikimora, you need to understand the space she inhabits. The traditional Russian peasant house, the izba, was not simply a shelter. It was a symbolic universe, a carefully organized space that encoded the cosmological and social values of the people who built it and lived in it. The izba was oriented in space according to a consistent logic. The most important corner, the beautiful corner, or krasny ugol, was the corner diagonally opposite the door, typically oriented toward the southeast or east. This was the spiritual corner of the house, where the icons were hung, where the family altar was maintained, where guests were honored. When you entered a traditional Russian house, you bowed to the icons first, then greeted the family. The beautiful corner was the house's connection to the divine and to the community, the public, honored, spiritually elevated part of the domestic space. The stove, the pech, was the heart of the house in a more practical and domestic sense. It was the source of heat and cooking, but it was also the center of the house's spiritual life in the folk sense, the home of the domovoi, the warm heart around which domestic life organized itself. The stove was not just a piece of equipment, it was the most sacred object in the domestic space, and the area around it was associated with the most intimate and private aspects of family life. Kikimora lived in the hidden spaces of this symbolic universe. Behind the stove, in the dark space between the stove's back and the wall, was one of her preferred locations. Under the floor in the cellar, where the food was stored in darkness, and where the house was in closest contact with the earth beneath it. In the walls, in the space between the outer and inner wall, in the hidden structural space of the building itself, in the threshold, the liminal zone between inside and outside, neither fully in nor fully out. These locations are all threshold zones. They are the margins of the domestic space, the places that are neither one thing nor another. The space behind the stove is neither the active living space of the house nor the outside. It is between the house's heart and the house's edge. The space under the floor is between the house and the earth. The walls are between inside and outside. The threshold is between domestic and public. Kikimora is a creature of margins. She inhabits the in-between spaces of the house as she inhabits the in-between spaces of the social and spiritual order. She is the spirit of the threshold, and the threshold, in folk belief across many cultures, is where the supernatural is most present, where the boundary between worlds is thinnest, where the most powerful magic happens. The architecture of the traditional house was designed in part to manage these threshold zones. The threshold of the door was protected by iron nails or bars embedded in it. The space under the floor was sometimes addressed with specific rituals. The corners of the house were marked with protective substances. The hidden spaces that Kikimora inhabited were not ignored but actively managed, recognized as spiritually significant and requiring attention. In this sense, the traditional Russian house was designed as a kind of supernatural management system. Every structural feature, every spatial decision, every ritual practice associated with the house was part of a system for maintaining the balance between the human domestic world and the supernatural world that interpenetrated it. Kikimora was part of that system, not as an intruder to be expelled, but as a factor to be managed, a force to be kept in its proper place and in its proper relationship to the household. Understanding the house this way, as a system in which the physical and the spiritual are fully integrated, in which the architecture itself is a form of cosmological argument, in which the placement of the stove and the orientation of the corners and the treatment of the threshold are all part of a unified understanding of what a home is, makes the modern concept of a house feel impoverished by comparison. We build houses without any such integration. Our architectural decisions are made on the basis of cost, efficiency, aesthetic preference. We do not think about what lives in the walls, or what the threshold means, or how to orient the sacred corner. And perhaps that is part of why the haunted house remains such a powerful concept for us. Because somewhere in our cultural memory is the knowledge that a house is not just a structure, that it is a lived relationship between people and place and history and the invisible, and that when that relationship is not properly tended, something goes wrong. We do not have Kikimora to blame for it anymore, but we still feel it. We are living in a world that has given us electric light, germ theory, sleep science, and a dozen other frameworks that should, in principle, have made Kikimora obsolete. We know why children get sick. We know why we experience sleep paralysis. We know why houses make noises. We know why thread tangles. And yet Kikimora persists, not just as a cultural artifact, not just as a subject for academic study or an element of popular culture, but as a living belief in communities where people still describe experiences that they attribute to her presence. Fieldwork conducted in rural Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian communities in the 1990s and 2000s documented ongoing reports of Kikimora-type experiences, ongoing use of traditional protective measures, ongoing consultation of folk specialists for Kikimora-related problems. Why does she persist? Several reasons, none of which is simply the ignorance of the people involved. First, the experiences she represents, sleep paralysis, domestic disorder, infant illness, the feeling of a presence in the house, have not disappeared. The experiences are real. What varies is the interpretive framework applied to them. In a community that maintains the folk tradition, those experiences are interpreted within that framework. The tradition offers not just an explanation, but a set of practical responses, a sense of agency, a path through the problem. Sleep paralysis is terrifying. Being told it is Kikimora sitting on your chest and being given specific things you can do to prevent it does not eliminate the experience, but it gives you something to do with it. It puts it in a framework of meaning. Second, the tradition addresses emotional and social realities that the scientific medical framework does not fully address. The grief of losing a child, especially a child who died very young before it had a name or a face in the community, is not fully addressed by any secular framework. The acknowledgement that the child is still there, still present, still needing acknowledgement, this meets a real psychological need that a purely biomedical account of neonatal mortality does not meet. Third, the tradition provides a language for talking about the house as a living entity, with a history and a spiritual character that people find genuinely useful. The idea that the atmosphere of a house reflects its history, that a house where bad things happen feels different from a house where people have been happy, is something that many people, not just those in folk traditions, find resonant. The vocabulary of house spirits, of domestic supernatural beings who embody the house's accumulated history, gives this intuition a language and a framework. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, Kikimora persists because the domestic sphere still generates the kind of anxiety she represents. The home is still the most intimate and most vulnerable space in human life. The night is still the most vulnerable time. The relationship between the visible and the invisible, the explained and the unexplained, the managed and the unmanageable. These are still live tensions in human life. The scientific explanations for specific phenomena have not resolved the underlying anxiety that gives rise to those phenomena. The haunted house is still a powerful trope because it is still a powerful experience. And Kikimora, who lives in the haunted house, who is the spirit of the unresolved and the incomplete, has not yet been made obsolete. There is also a fifth reason that is perhaps harder to articulate, but that I think is real. The folk tradition, with its recognition of the invisible life of the house and its acknowledgement of grief and incompleteness and the past that lives in walls, offers something that the modern secular framework often fails to provide: a way of being at home in the mystery, a way of living with the not quite explained without being destroyed by it. Modern rationalism sometimes demands that we explain everything or dismiss it. The folk tradition offers a third option: acknowledge it, name it, give it a place in the household cosmology. Speak to it in the evening, as that mother spoke to her Kikimora, saying, "You are a lost one. You are someone who did not finish your life." Acknowledge the incompleteness without pretending it is not there and without being consumed by it. That is a form of wisdom, and it is part of why Kikimora is still with us. We have come a long way from that 30-second hook at the beginning, from the creak in the night, and the weight on the chest and the feeling of being watched in the dark. But those experiences have been with us throughout this entire journey. Everything we have explored, the etymology, the appearances, the origin stories, the rituals, the literary history, the psychology, the comparative mythology, the architecture of the traditional house, all of it has been an attempt to understand those experiences, to give them a context, to place them in the web of human meaning that the folk tradition wove around them over centuries. What have we learned? We have learned that Kikimora is old, older than Christianity, older than the written record, older than the specific cultural forms that have expressed her. She reaches back into the deepest layers of Slavic religion, and from there into the Indo-European heritage that preceded it, into the ancient understanding of fate as thread, of the dead as present, of the house as a spiritual entity, of the feminine supernatural as the power that inhabits the intimate and the hidden spaces of human life. We have learned that she is complex, not a simple monster, not a straightforward threat. She is ambivalent, helpful or harmful, depending on the condition of the household she inhabits and on how she is treated. She is multiple, different in different regions, different in different centuries, different depending on her origin and her history. She is not a fixed figure, but a dynamic one, always adapting, always changing, always finding new ways to express the fundamental anxieties and realities that she represents. We have learned that she is not simply a superstition. She is a system of meaning, a way of thinking about grief and guilt and the history of a space, a way of acknowledging the unresolved and the incomplete, a way of talking about what is in the walls of the house that cannot easily be addressed in any other terms. She encodes real human experiences in a form that gives them shape and meaning and the possibility of response. We have learned that she persists. Centuries of Christianity did not eliminate her. Decades of Soviet atheism did not eliminate her. Modernization and urbanization and the electric light and the internet have not eliminated her. She has adapted and survived because the experiences and anxieties she addresses have not been eliminated. They are still here, in our houses, in our nights, in the way we feel sometimes in the dark. And we have learned that she deserves to be taken seriously, not in the sense of believing that there is literally a small, thin woman with tangled hair living behind your stove, but in the sense that the tradition that produced her and the people who maintain that tradition across centuries were engaged in something genuinely valuable. They were trying to understand the house as a living space, with a history, in a spiritual dimension. They were trying to acknowledge grief and loss, and the unresolved past. They were trying to maintain a relationship with the dead and with the ground under their feet. They were trying to live with the night. We do not have better answers to these needs. We have different answers, and in many cases more powerful answers to specific problems within them. We understand sleep paralysis now in ways that the folk tradition did not. We understand infant mortality in ways that the folk tradition did not. But we do not have better answers to the fundamental question of what it means to inhabit a house, to try to make a home in a specific place that has a history, to bring a family through the darkness together. Kikimora is the spirit of everything that tries to do that work and fails. The child who did not survive, the marriage that broke, the house that was built on the wrong ground, the grief that was never properly named. She is the spirit of the incomplete. And the reason she is still in the walls, the reason you will still sometimes hear her late at night when the house is quiet and you are between sleeping and waking, is that incompleteness is a permanent feature of human life. Something will always be unresolved. Something will always be left unfinished. Something will always be in the walls. The creak in the night is real. Whatever made it, it is real, and it belongs to the long chain of creaks that have kept people awake in houses like yours for as long as people have built houses and tried to sleep inside them. Kikimora has been listening to that creak for a very long time, and she is not done yet.